Churchill was sitting in the White House with President Franklin Roosevelt on June 21, 1942 when the telegram arrived. He was there to celebrate the partnership. Instead, he had to open the worst news of the war in front of his more powerful ally. Tobruk had fallen to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. 33,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers had surrendered. It was one of the largest capitulations in British military history. The fortress that was supposed to hold indefinitely had collapsed in a single day. Churchill later wrote about the moment he received the news in Roosevelt's presence. "Defeat is one thing," he said. "Disgrace is another." The humiliation wasn't just the military loss. It was failing in front of the man whose help Britain desperately needed. Roosevelt looked at the British Prime Minister and saw genuine shock. This wasn't just a military setback. This was a potential catastrophe that threatened Britain's entire position in the Mediterranean. The strategic situation was collapsing. Rommel's Africa Corps was now 200 miles from the Suez Canal. Egypt was threatened. The entire British position in the Middle East was on the verge of total collapse. In Cairo, British officials were burning documents. On July 1, so much paper ash fell from the chimneys of British headquarters that Egyptians called it Ash Wednesday. They were preparing for German occupation. Churchill understood what this meant. Without Egypt, Britain would lose access to Middle Eastern oil. Without the Suez Canal, convoys would have to sail around Africa. Without North Africa, the entire Mediterranean would become an Axis lake. The Desert Fox had won again. And this time, there was no defensive line left to stop him. Roosevelt asked Churchill a simple question. What can we do to help? Churchill's answer was blunt. Give us as many Sherman tanks as you can spare. The M4 Sherman was brand new. These were the first Shermans off American production lines. The 1st and 2nd Armored Divisions were training on them for eventual combat. Roosevelt would have to take those tanks and send them across the Atlantic. Roosevelt didn't hesitate. He turned to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall and asked what could be done. Marshall understood the necessity. Britain had to survive in North Africa or the entire Allied strategy would collapse. But he also understood what this would cost. He would have to tell American soldiers in Kentucky and Texas that their tanks were going to Egypt. That British failures meant American boys would wait. The decision was a sacrifice, not a policy. 300 M4 Sherman medium tanks would be diverted from American stocks. 100 M7 Priest self-propelled guns would go with them. American armored divisions would have to wait months for replacement equipment. The reason Churchill needed American tanks was simple. British tanks couldn't fight German tanks and win. The British 8th Army was equipped with Crusader and Valentine tanks. Both mounted the 2-pounder gun, a 40mm weapon that had been obsolete since 1940. British tank crews knew the sound, the 2-pounder ping, the metallic ring of their shell bouncing off German armor. Then the terrifying silence as the Panzer turret slowly turned toward them. Against the newer Panzer III and Panzer IV, British crews were dying because their shells couldn't penetrate. The technical problem was worse than penetration. The 2-pounder couldn't fire high explosive shells. British tanks had no way to kill German anti-tank gun crews. They could only fire armor-piercing rounds that were useless against infantry and artillery positions. German 88mm anti-tank guns would sit behind the Panzers and destroy British tanks with impunity. British crews could only die or retreat. The British did have some American M3 Grant and Lee tanks with 75mm guns. But the M3 was a stopgap design with the gun mounted in a hull sponson. The tank couldn't fight hull down. It had to expose its entire body to fire. While the Sherman could peak just its turret over a ridge. It was better than the Crusader, but still inferior to German armor. The Sherman offered something British tanks didn't have. The 75mm gun could fire both armor-piercing and high-explosive shells. It could kill panzers and suppress anti-tank guns. It was the first Allied tank that could face the Panzer IV Special on equal terms. 300 Sherman tanks and 100 self-propelled guns left American ports in July 1942. The shipment represented thousands of tons of equipment, ammunition, and spare parts. The tanks couldn't travel through the Mediterranean. German and Italian aircraft controlled that sea. The ships would sail south around the Cape of Good Hope. The voyage would take months through 15,000 miles of U-boat-infested waters. Churchill knew every day counted. Rommel was regrouping for a final push toward the Suez Canal. On July 16, 1942, the SS Fairport was steaming north of Cuba when German submarine U-161 found her. The torpedo struck amidships. The ship went down quickly. 52 Sherman tanks sank with the Fairport. Worse, the ammunition, engines, and spare parts went to the bottom. Steel hulls could be replaced. Radial engines and precision parts took months to manufacture. Nearly 1/6 of the shipment was gone. Churchill began composing a message to Roosevelt explaining the loss and requesting replacements. When he received unexpected news from Washington, the Americans had already sent them. The United States government didn't wait for Churchill to ask. Within days of the Fairport sinking, American officials ordered a replacement shipment. The SSC Train Texas was loaded with 52 Sherman tanks, and the engines lost with the Fairport. The ship was a specialized heavy-lift vessel, faster than standard merchant ships. Then it sailed alone. No convoy protection, no destroyer escorts, just one ship crossing the Atlantic at maximum speed through waters where U-boats hunted in packs. The crew knew the stakes. If they were spotted, they were dead. If they didn't make it, Montgomery's offensive would fail. It was a ghost ship racing against time and German torpedoes. The gamble worked. Despite leaving port weeks later, the Sea-Train Texas arrived at Port Taufiq on September 3, the same time as the surviving ships from the original convoy. The replacement tanks arrived on schedule. Churchill later wrote that a friend in need is a friend indeed. Bernard Montgomery took command of the British 8th Army on August 13, 1942. He was 54 years old, methodical, and absolutely convinced of his own genius. Montgomery reviewed the tactical situation and came to an immediate conclusion. He would not attack until the American tanks arrived and his crews were trained on them. Churchill was furious. He needed a victory to save his political career. The British public was demanding action. Parliament was questioning his leadership. Rommel was exhausted from his advance, his supply lines stretched thin. Every day of delay gave the Germans time to dig in and reinforce. Montgomery refused with icy professionalism. He told Churchill that attacking with inadequate equipment would result in another defeat. British tank crews needed time to master the Sherman systems. The gun sighting was different. The engine was different. The armor thickness changed tactical doctrine. Churchill sent messages demanding action. Montgomery sent back detailed explanations of why rushing into battle would be disastrous. The tension was simple. Churchill needed a victory now. Montgomery needed to win. The attack would wait for the Shermans. Montgomery's arrogance was actually a shield for the American tanks he knew he needed. The Sherman tanks began arriving at Port Taufiq in early September 1942. British tank crews saw them unloaded and understood immediately that these were different from anything they'd operated before. The Sherman was heavier than British tanks. The radial engine was more powerful, but also more complex. The 75mm gun required different ammunition handling procedures. Everything from the transmission to the turret traverse mechanism was unfamiliar. Montgomery allocated 1 month for crew training and mechanical modifications. The Shermans needed sand shields and internal storage adjustments to meet British desert standards. British engineers developed the Sun Shield, a camouflage framework that made a Sherman look like a standard truck from the air. German reconnaissance aircraft couldn't count Montgomery's armor. Mechanical failures in combat meant death. Every crew member needed to know the tank intimately. September passed with Montgomery's forces training while Churchill sent increasingly angry messages from London. British crews drilled on the Shermans daily. Drivers learned the transmission. Gunners mastered the new sights. Loaders practiced ammunition handling until they could reload in darkness. By early October, Montgomery's army included approximately 250 to 300 operational Sherman tanks. They represented 30% of his total armored strength. But they would provide the bulk of his heavy-hitting power. Montgomery was ready. The attack would begin on October 23, 1942. The Battle of El Alamein began at 9:40 p.m. on October 23. With a massive artillery barrage, 1,000 guns opened fire simultaneously. The bombardment lit up the desert night. At 10 p.m., Montgomery's armor began advancing through the minefields. The Shermans led the break-in assault. The heavy-hitting power of the 1st and 10th Armored Divisions Their 75mm guns engaged German anti-tank positions while infantry cleared paths through the mines. British Crusaders, faster but outgunned, were used for high-speed flanking on the wings. Each tank had its role. The Shermans broke through. The Crusaders exploited the gaps. The difference in firepower was immediately apparent. German gunners could engage Crusaders with confidence. But the Shermans could suppress anti-tank positions with high explosive shells while their armor deflected most German anti-tank rounds at combat ranges. The battle became a brutal slugging match. German defenders fought desperately. Rommel threw his panzer reserves into counterattacks. For 12 days, the Desert War became a test of which side's tanks could survive concentrated fire. The Shermans survived. British crews found that German shells that would have penetrated a Crusader were stopped by Sherman armor. The 75mm gun could engage panzers at ranges where the 2-pounder was useless. By November 4, German resistance was collapsing. Rommel had lost most of his armor. The Afrika Korps was retreating west. Montgomery's forces had broken through at El Alamein. The British 8th Army had won its first clear victory against Rommel. American steel had made the difference. On November 10, 1942, Winston Churchill stood before a crowd at the Mansion House in London to celebrate the El Alamein victory. He delivered one of his most famous speeches. "Now, this is not the end," he said. "It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning." The speech praised British and Empire troops. Churchill spoke of British courage, British determination, and British fighting spirit. He mentioned fire and steel but not the factories that had forged the steel or the ships that had delivered it. He stood at the podium basking in the glory. But in the back of his mind, he knew those tanks were American. 30% of Montgomery's armor had come from Detroit. The shells that killed German panzers had been manufactured in Pennsylvania. The British public heard about their army's triumph. They heard about Montgomery's genius and British resilience. They didn't hear about the Fairport or the Sea Train Texas. They didn't hear that American industry had made the victory possible. Churchill was selling a British victory to buy time for an empire that was running out of steam. Years later, Churchill wrote his war memoirs. In The Hinge of Fate, he acknowledged what he couldn't say in 1942. He described Roosevelt's immediate response to the Tobruk crisis. He detailed the diversion of 300 Shermans from American armored divisions. He called the tanks precious and gave full credit to American industrial might. Before Alamein, he wrote, "We never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. The battle was a turning point because of what the Americans had provided." But memoirs are read by historians, not by the masses. The public mythology remained unchanged. Montgomery's genius had defeated Rommel. British grit had won the Desert War. And the dependency Churchill privately acknowledged in his memoirs had become total by 1944. 60 to 70% of the British 8th Army's trucks were American-made. The GMC-CCKW, the American 2.5-ton truck, was the backbone of Montgomery's supply line from the ports to the front. British logistics ran on American wheels. The tanks that led the advance through Italy and France were American Shermans. The aircraft providing close air support were American P-40 Kitty Hawks. The fuel that powered British operations came from American tankers crossing the Atlantic. Without American production, the British Army would have been immobile. The empire that ruled a quarter of the globe couldn't equip its own forces for modern warfare. The history books often frame El Alamein as the British turning point of the war. And in terms of the men on the ground, that is true. British grit and Commonwealth courage were the blood paid for every mile of sand. But the fire and steel Churchill spoke of in his victory speeches didn't originate in London. The dependency that began in the White House in June 1942 was a sobering reality that Churchill spent the rest of his life managing. It was a secret kept to preserve the dignity of an empire that was rapidly running out of time. The partnership between the two powers saved the West. It was a bond that won the war. But the logistics of North Africa proved that the world had changed. The era of the British Empire was over. The era of the American superpower had begun. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel.